Ja, god kvöld, og velkommen til dette utgavetiltaket til KFS, i samband med nødvendig bøkutgavene Hvar god heimi med koronavirusi. Jeg heter Ragnar Petersen, og jeg daglig leder KFS, og jeg versten i kvöld. Gesten i kvöld er nok som alle kunnet til John Lennox. Han professor i Oxford University. Han visdomsmedlem, og han skrevet noen bøker. Til dømes Gunning for God, som KFS og Språten gav ut i 2018. Hon er så god for skottene av føreskånd. Og han reisende tjekket seg nekker av de fremste ateistene i heimene, til dømes Richard Dawkins og Christopher Hitchens Sala og Peter Singer. I kveld tror jeg til han samråd ved John Lennox, jeg bryr vi. Det var så om innholdet og i sånn utbjørelsen til honom. Og det var så en liten halve tøyme kanskje, en samråd. Og det var så om jeg ser bøkene her, som vi tar i GVO, som kommer ut i det. Hun er døylig fitt og lydel. Lagt å lese som holdt, og ser det avhørt. Vi tar litt stek i mine, 18 samrådene, per på en rujam noter som alle kan kanskje fylle på koppen etter, og så fortsetter vi Q&A, eller spørningen og sværen fra John Lennox, her han fra svære på spørninger til Hitchernon. Og det er således at de kan sende spørninger inn. Det er til et telefonnummer, som øyter 28 75 75, det kommer så i skjermen sattene, og det som er til at man kan skrive spørninger nye på en av veien, det er faktisk 4 måneder, tror jeg at hvis man bor inntil samrådene ved enda, så kan alle spørninger fra snikke seg om den største parten av samrådene, ikke den første parten. Så skriv bare nye på en av veien og sender spørninger inn, og det som vi så gjør at vi balker spørningene etter evnen, og så røyene kommer rundt i de høyla. De kan skrive spørninger av førskånd, og de kan skrive enskånd, det er opp til dem. Så er det folk som takker seg av tog. Nu får vi at skifta i til engst. Og it's my pleasure to welcome our special guest tonight. It's Professor John Lennox. Welcome to the Faroe Islands. Hello, John.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be in the Faroe Islands again. I had a memorable visit 6 or 7 years ago, and I've never forgotten it. So even to be there in virtual reality is something that gives me great pleasure.
That's good to hear. Perhaps we could just jump into the conversation about your book, Where is God in the Coronavirus World? Thankfully, in the Faroe Islands, we have not been hit so hard by the coronavirus. It's a totally different story in your country, I can understand. And you've been in lockdown for almost 2.5 months, I guess. And what's life been in lockdown for so long?
Well, my wife and I are in the highly vulnerable group in our mid-70s. And so we have been in lockdown. But granted that, I've been able to do a vast amount of work, including writing the book. But I've been revising many other books, and the efficiency of the work for the past couple of months has been very productive indeed. But that's a selfish view, because we're very aware that this country was not prepared for this. They haven't dealt with it very well, like some other countries. And they're undoing the lockdown, and many medical people think they're doing it too fast, and they'll get another huge spike in cases. So it is a very worrying situation.
Yeah, it doesn't sound good. So if we move on in the conversation and start talking about the book, I'd like to ask you, what was it that prompted you to, start writing this book, and what kind of questions does it seek to answer?
Well, partly because I am a mathematician, and most mathematicians know about exponential growth. And when they started talking about an epidemic, not a pandemic, I saw almost immediately that this is going to go around the world very rapidly, and it's going to be scary. And I wondered, could I do anything? I'm an elderly academic, but I wondered whether I could sit down and write something that perhaps was able to show that Christianity has got something to say into this. Not something trivial, because there are no simple answers to these big questions, But because I have a personal hope, I wanted to try to deal with some of the questions that people ask. And so I sat down and wrote all day long and part of the night for a week. I then sent the manuscript to a publisher on a Saturday evening, and on Wednesday of the next week it was already being printed, and it's now in over 25 languages. So it's been absolutely amazing. The publishers around the world have done a huge job. And in many countries, poorer countries, it's available free on the internet in Chinese, Russian, 4 Indian languages, Indonesian, and all this kind of thing. So I'm quite overwhelmed with the response to it.
Wow, yeah, that sounds impressive. In the book, you are mentioning 2 basic problems, 2 kinds of evil. Could you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yes, certainly. It's a categorization into what we call moral evil. That's the bad things people do to each other. And natural evil, which sounds like a contradiction because evil is a moral concept. But natural evil we use to describe tragedies where human beings aren't necessarily directly involved, like tsunamis, like cancer, and like coronavirus. And these 2 things can be closely linked. For example, the coronavirus, so I'm told by some experts, started by leaping from animals to human beings. Now, why did that happen? The experts tell us that these animals, very valuable wild animals, were removed from their natural habitat and confined to cages, and they got stressed. And when wild animals are stressed, they excrete millions of viruses. And it's reckoned that that's what happened. Now, if that's what happened originally, then the cause of it was greed, people wanting to make a lot of money out of selling animals that they should have left alone. So there may have been moral evil at the start, but of course the people responsible for that had no idea what they were starting off, and now it has become what we call a natural evil.
Okay. So when you have both moral and natural evil in this world, it could be tempting to think that atheism is the easiest and perhaps the most straightforward response to a situation like this one that we're in right now.
It is the easiest response, certainly, but it's not the best response, but it is the easiest. And atheists, and I understand them very well, I first came across this kind of situation in 2011 in New Zealand when I arrived just after the earthquake, and all the same questions came up. And many people said, well, look, isn't it obvious that this earthquake proves there is no God, and we've just got to accept that and move on? That's the easy answer. It is the easy answer, but I do not find it satisfying at all for several reasons. Firstly, it removes an intellectual problem in one sense, but it creates a whole lot of other problems. Firstly, intellectual problems, because if there is no God, it's very hard to see how you get a concept of evil. And even Richard Dawkins, whom I have debated, says quite honestly that his atheism leads him to believe that the universe is what you'd expect it to be. If at bottom there's no good, no evil, and no justice. So his atheism denies morality. Well, it's a bit foolish then to talk about the problem of evil. So that's one of the intellectual problems. But then there's the very obvious problem. The atheist solution does not remove the suffering. And indeed, it can make it worse, because what atheism does remove is all ultimate hope by definition. Because for an atheist, death is the end. And if you've no solution to death, then you have no ultimate hope to offer anybody. let alone people infected with COVID-19. So although it looks attractive to many people, I think it just doesn't work.
Okay. So even if we see moral and natural evil perhaps on a daily basis all over the world, you still think that the idea of a good and loving God makes sense. And then it's tempting to ask, what kind of God would create a universe like this one, and why are things the way they are if there is a loving God?
That is not only a tempting question, it's an important question. And I've asked it all my life because it's a very famous question. And the way I approach it, it's a hard question. Let me tell you that. I do not find this an easy question. But let's take it and put it this way. Often people say, why didn't God make a world in which nobody did any wrong? Couldn't he do that? Well, my answer may surprise some people watching me tonight. Of course he could make a world in which there was no evil and no good. He could make a world full of robotic creatures that were simply programmed. But you see, I often say to people who say, I wish God had done this, I say, but you would not have been in that world. And they say, what do you mean? Well, the greatest gift that you have, I believe, from God is the freedom of your power to decide yes or no. If you didn't have that, you would have no love. There'd be no good and no evil. You would simply be a robot or a puppet on a string. Now, think about it. I have 3 children, 10 grandchildren. When my first child was born, a little girl, I held her in my arms and I suddenly thought, you could grow up to reject me. You could grow up to use your freedom to turn away from your father. Why have children? Well, we know the answer to that because those of us who are parents, and I'm sure I'm speaking to many parents, know that the reward of having love in a family and a relationship with your children is well worth that risk. And God did take a risk in creating creatures like us because he wanted to give us the full riches of what it means to be human. But you see, if you create creatures capable of love, capable of good, then by definition, they're capable of saying no. So the situation we are in, to cut a long story very short, is that I believe that there is an original connection between human freedom and disobedience to God and physical consequences. I'd like to just say to you what the Christian apostle Paul says. He said that through one man, sin entered into the world and death through sin. And so death passed upon all human beings. In other words, the disobedience to God, which is moral evil, resulted in physical death. And the ancient story in Genesis tells us that God said to the human beings, look, you'll be able to grow wheat and you'll be able to live off that, but the ground will produce also thorns and thistles, and that will make life difficult. And so we have earthquakes and COVID-19. Now, there are a lot more questions behind that, but it seems to me that the biblical story tells me that this problem was generated long before I was born. It's not my fault. It's not your fault. Now, has God done anything about that? And that's where the Christian answer is unique. It doesn't compete with any other answer because God says, yes, it's not all your fault, and therefore you cannot put it right. You cannot earn a solution to this by your good behavior. So I will do something that all you have to do is receive, and you will be granted forgiveness and a relationship with God that COVID-19 can't touch. And that's why I'm talking to you as a Christian tonight, because I believe that that message is true and it corresponds to the reality of problems of suffering and evil that are far bigger than any of us can deal with. That's just the start of an answer. And it's why I wrote a book. There's much more information in the book that I've just given you.
Yeah. You said earlier that atheism, for example, removes all hope. And then there's the fact that we as human beings, we tend to, by instinct, to look for hope in times of crisis.
Indeed.
And that kind of doesn't make atheism a good fit for us. But why do you think that Christianity does any better when we talk about providing hope?
Well, because it faces the question of death. What coronavirus does on the large scale is what every death does. An individual death for those near to it raises exactly the same questions as COVID-19. What is the significance of death? Is there any answer to it? And at the heart of Christianity, there is the claim that God became human in Jesus Christ. And he not only died, which means, of course, that God has not remained distant from the problem of suffering and evil, but has become part of it. That's one side. But the second side is the central Christian claim that set Christianity going, and it's why I am a Christian as a scientist and an academic, is that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Now, if that's true, I want to know about it, because it means that someone has presented a solution to physical death. And it's very interesting to me. I've just written another book on artificial intelligence. And in that book, I describe the current desire to solve the physical problem of death. Yuval Harari has written a book called Homo Deus, in which he says that the big agenda for this century is to solve the technical problem of death, and we're going to do it. And when I read that book, I thought, but it's already been solved. And it's the heart of the Christian faith. And so to say that does Christianity do any better? It does infinitely better, because it gives us a focal point. It gives us a hope. We, of course, have to explore what that hope means, because it certainly doesn't mean that if I believe it, I won't be killed by COVID-19 in the next 2 weeks. I cannot know that. But I know if that happens, that I will rise again eventually, because God has given me the very life that raised Christ from the dead. So this is a huge thing. And it surprises me sometimes that people aren't more interested in it. If there's any evidence anywhere in the world that someone has risen from the dead, and it's a credible fact, well, I would have thought that the first thing to do is find out as much as you possibly can about it, because deep down in every human heart, and you see it today, there is a fear of death. Our churches, Ragnard, I think it was last week, 25% of the nation watched part or all of a church service. That's unheard of. We've got less than 4%, I think, church attendance. People have suddenly woken up to the fact that they need to think about these big questions.
You mentioned in your book that there are kind of two perspectives on this situation. There's the intellectual one, and then there's the emotional one. Could you say a bit more about that?
Certainly, and I think it's very important, especially as I'm an academic, and people tend to think, he's only interested in the intellectual side. But there are two sides, and there's a wonderful story, if I might use it, in the New Testament that again shows us that the Bible's very sensitive to the issue. It's a story about a tiny tragedy in a very small family. Two sisters, Mary and Martha, their brother Lazarus, who lived in a village, Bethany, just over the hill from Jerusalem. And Lazarus was sick, and they knew Jesus. He was a friend. They sent him a message saying, Lord, the one you love is sick. And Jesus was miles away. And of course, they thought he would come, but he didn't come. And that raised a huge question in their mind. Why doesn't he come? Why does he keep at a social distance? Is he in quarantine? Surely he'll come. And they waited and waited, and Lazarus got worse and eventually died. So they had to go through the grief, the pain, and then Jesus turns up. What were they to say? Well, the first sister went out and met him and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, that's fascinating because it shows she believed he had the power to do something if only he had been there, but he wasn't there. And that raises a question that many people today have. Where is God? Why isn't he here? I believe he's got the power to do something, but he isn't here. And he said to her, Martha, your brother's going to rise again. And they started a high-powered intellectual discussion about the resurrection in which she already believed. Yes, I know, he'll rise at the last day. And Jesus said, Martha, I didn't mean that. What you need to learn is something far bigger. I am the resurrection. That is a staggering statement. And then he said, a person who believes in me, even though he or she dies, yet they will live. And her sister then arrived, said exactly the same words. Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. And then she started to weep. And instead of entering into a high-powered intellectual discussion with Mary, Jesus wept as well. And if we for a moment think of what that means, were these crocodile tears? After all, he had let the man die. He had the power to heal him, but he didn't come. And he wept when he saw what death had done to that little group. And that shows, I believe, the heart of God. Now, he knew what he was going to do. They didn't. And he then raised Lazarus from the dead and gave him back to the family. And I believe that shows several things. First of all, that God is interested in our big questions and he's got answers to them. Secondly, he's interested in giving us emotional comfort. Now, as I look at television and I see people dying of COVID-19 and their relatives aren't even allowed to hug them goodbye, it really goes to my heart. It's terrible. I can't imagine what that's like. They want a touch, they want a hug, if only they could get it, but they can't get it. And therefore, to me, it's very important that we seek at whatever level we can to bring both levels to people, not only intellectual answers, but emotional and counseling answers. But not only counseling answers, intellectual answers as well, because if Christianity is true, it's going to respond to the whole person, not just my brain, but my heart as well.
Yeah, and that's perhaps something you address in your last chapter in the book, and the difference that God makes. So we will be drawing the interview to a close now, but we can all see that the coronavirus has caused terrible suffering around the world. But do you think that we could actually learn something good from this coronavirus?
Well, let me give you another story which is in the book, and it illustrates the two kinds of evil brilliantly. Jesus was on the Temple Mountain, and somebody in the crowd said, Lord, this is the place where Pilate came out and massacred with his soldiers a number of worshippers. And Jesus turned round and he said, do you think they were worse than anybody else around at the time? And then he said, and there was another incident when the Tower of Siloam fell and killed 18 people. Do you think they were worse than anybody else? Now, I'm mentioning that because many people, I'm afraid, say, this coronavirus is the judgment of God. We need to be very careful with that. Because here's Jesus commenting on two tragedies, a moral tragedy, a massacre, and a natural tragedy, the falling of a tower. And he's saying to people and to us, when you see a tragedy, you cannot necessarily assume that its victims are worse than anybody else. But then he said this, except you all repent you will likewise perish. Now, what did he mean? He certainly didn't mean that there are only two ways of dying, one to be massacred in church and the other for a tower to fall on you. But what I think he meant is this, and I can see it all around me. When you see tragedy, small or large, particularly if it's close to you, it raises big questions. It shows us that we are vulnerable, that we're not in control, that we're mortal. We thought we got it all sorted, that there'd never be anything like this again because the medicine we've got is so much better than it used to be. And then you start thinking about death. And you can't stop there. You start thinking about eternity and God. So that, as C.S. Lewis said years ago, this kind of event acts as a megaphone, a loudspeaker, that wakes us up to reality. And I think that is the effect we're seeing. It's that's driving people to watch online church services. They've got time if they're in lockdown. And they're thinking a lot more about these things than they used to. So if it acts as a wake-up call, think of Europe. Here I am in Europe as a European, and the constitution of the EU doesn't even mention God. And for years, we've simply ignored God and either pretended he doesn't exist or argued that he doesn't exist. This is a huge wake-up call to rethink that whole issue. And that would be a positive outcome. I don't like to speak of all clouds of silver linings. That can be dangerous kind of talk. But if you say, can anything good come out of it? I think for individuals, yes. If it turns them to think about these bigger questions in life, and if it shows them and points them towards something that they can, for themselves, believe in, that has evidence behind it and can change their lives and their relationships around. Because if you've got a relationship with God of which you are certain because of what Christ has done, all of COVID-19 and death and everything else looks very different.
And perhaps it also challenges Christians to have a different perspective. I mean, you have a section in the book on loving your neighbor. What could you say about that?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, absolutely. And I'm so impressed, not only with Christians, but people of all faiths and none, the way they've been reaching out to their neighbors. We're locked down, we're elderly. Our neighbors have offered to do shopping. And that neighborliness has really been shown all around the world. It would be a sad thing if it completely disappears when this is over. But certainly for Christians, it makes us rethink. And there are things you can do in lockdown. Now, I know it doesn't affect you much, but one of the things that people have been doing here is to think of people they haven't spoken to for years and telephone them. And sometimes that produces anger. Why didn't you contact me a long time ago? But often when the conversation is over, people are very grateful for the human contact. And I have the greatest admiration for doctors and medical staff who are risking their lives in this country to save people. Nearly 40,000 people have died in the United Kingdom, which is appalling. If we had dealt with this as New Zealand has, we would have had between 200 and 300 deaths, not 40,000. So it really shows that there's been systemic failure at many levels. But that doesn't answer the question. We have to face the picture that we're in and do what we can.
Yeah. Well, time goes fast, and I think we have reached the end of the conversation, and we'll probably continue with questions in a moment. But for now, we will have a short break for around 3 minutes, and then we will be back. Så ja, hetta var samrøðan við John Lennox, og ja, vi tar en liten stekk nå, og så holder jeg fram. De kan lukka fylle på koppen eller akkurat med igjen. Ja, velkommen atter. Så for at jeg begynner spornarløtene vi John Lennox, og hun vil nok en der små 40 minutter. Her fra svære spurninger fra Tikon Hidjaron. Det noen spurninger kommer inn, og Tikon sender flere spurninger inn av nummer 875. Og som sagt, vi røyner balkadreis evne, så at vi kommer via og i sånne evne i kveld. John, there are some questions, and perhaps we should just jump straight into it.
Sure.
We could take the first question here. You say that natural evil is not our fault. It's the fault of those before us. So where is the justice of us getting judged in this world for 60 to 100 years for the faults of our ancestors, even if there's justice in the afterlife?
I said that natural evil, I should have been more precise, is not necessarily all our fault. We live in a world that has damage in it. But we mustn't get that out of proportion. There's a great deal of beauty in it. For instance, the coronavirus is a virus. There are millions of viruses around. Very few of them are pathogens like coronavirus. And that makes life very complicated. Let me use another illustration. Earthquakes. Now, earthquakes are a natural evil. They happen when the tectonic plates at the surface of the earth move. On my way to New Zealand, I read a book on plate tectonics, and I discovered to my amazement that the movement of those plates is absolutely essential for human life. We need those plates to move in order to give us oxygen in the atmosphere. So this makes things extremely complicated, that something that's necessary, the tectonic plates, actually are the things that cause damage. That is, if you build houses over a fault line, but you may not know where the fault line is. So in that sense, the questioner is right. But you see, the justice question would be perfectly valid if God expected us to put it right ourselves. You see, to grasp the size of the Christian gospel, the Christian message of salvation, it's precisely this. Some things are our fault. Of course they are. Some natural evils and moral evils are our fault. None of us is perfect. But there is also the damage that has come down. And we mustn't exaggerate it. Many people, possibly most of the people watching me, have had a certain amount of fulfillment in life. They've lived in a country where there's a good health service, where there are good job prospects and so on. So we must be thankful for that. But when it comes to putting things right or a solution, if God said, do it yourself, then I would think that was unjust. But if God says to me, look, you can't put this right because it's simply the fact. Your parents may have been good people. They weren't perfect. And so it goes on. So I'm going to do something that enables you to receive a life that gives you power to live and will transcend death and will give you forgiveness and peace with God and a permanent eternal relationship, because that is free. And I don't have to do it or earn it by my merit. That seems to me to be balancing things up, not just in the life to come, but in this life as well.
Here's one asking, maybe you addressed this already, I didn't hear the whole conversation, but with the coronavirus and natural evil in general, and with a God that created everything, did God design evil in the world, or who made it and why?
That is a fascinating question that all of us ask. The way it's put is interesting. Who made evil? Is evil something you make, or is evil a parasite on good? The story, as I understand it, is that sin, evil, if you like. People today don't like the word sin because it makes them think of God. So let's talk about evil coming into the world. It's as a result of human disobedience. The disobedience is evil. If you like, you could say people make it, but it's rather people do it. Now, the origin of that, the ultimate origin, is very obscure. In the Bible, we read certain stories about a higher level of being than humans that sinned. Now, not going to spend a lot of time on that, but before you laugh at it, just think for a minute, because I'm fascinated. Many of my scientific friends think the universe is full of life that is much higher than ours. But the moment I say yes, and that's what the Bible has said for centuries, they start to laugh, which is totally inconsistent. But that's something that needs to be pursued elsewhere. But I think that there is validity to it. But whatever the origin, you see, we'll not ultimately solve it satisfactorily. And therefore, I tend to ask a different question. We've all tried to answer the question that Ragnar asked earlier. Surely a good and all-powerful and all-loving God could do this, should have done that, and so on. We've all argued that. We've never come to a satisfactory answer to that question that I know of. So I'm a mathematician, and when we fail to answer one question, we don't give up. We try to ask another question. And I'm going to ask you another question, and it's harder than the first question. And it's this. We all face something that's irreducible. By that I mean we see a mixed picture. I went into the garden the other night and looked through my telescope at the Orion Nebula. Absolutely spectacular. I then came in and the television news was showing us an emergency hospital ward with people dying. And that's the picture that we confront no matter what we believe. All worldviews confront this. A mixed picture. I call it beauty and barbed wire. I could equally well call it beauty and COVID-19. Now, granted that it's like that, here's my question. And it's this. Is there any evidence anywhere that even though we cannot ultimately resolve these questions, is there a God that we could trust with it? Is there evidence for that? And I believe that we get that in Jesus Christ. You know, I have huge numbers of questions. And if I were to die of COVID-19 next week, I would go out into eternity full of questions. I hope I get them answered there. But I'm full of questions, but I don't proceed simply on the basis of having all the answers to the questions, because what I have learned in life is to trust a person who I believe is the answer, and that's a very different thing.
So there's perhaps a continuing question here. Is the coronavirus the punishment from God?
Well, I think I mentioned it earlier, but thank you for asking the question again. I think this is very dangerous ground. When I got to New Zealand just after the earthquake, there were some, well, they called themselves Christian, who said this was a punishment from God. There were then other people of a pantheistic persuasion who said, look, people are suffering because of their karma. They did not behave in a previous incarnation and they're suffering. So you should not help them, because if you do, you are condemning them to suffer even worse in their next incarnation, which is a terrible idea. But you see, they then said, yes, this is a punishment from God, because didn't God send plagues in the Old Testament? And I say yes. But we are told in Scripture what those were. I do not know any Scripture that refers to COVID-19. That's point one. Now, point two is to go back to what Jesus himself said about the two tragedies. That when you see a tragedy, whether a few people are killed or many, you cannot necessarily conclude that these people are worse than anybody else, that God is judging this nation or this group or these individuals. Now, of course, people can suffer because of their bad behavior. I mean, we know that ourselves. If I get drunk and drive my car very fast into a brick wall, I may end up a paraplegic. I'm suffering because of my own behavior. So I feel the bottom line for me is that Jesus has said it. And that's where I take my direction. And therefore, I'm very nervous of people who say it's a judgment of God. But my final point is, have you ever noticed how other people react to people who say that? They don't turn to God. They get very angry with the people that say such things. And they say, look, who do you think you are to say what God is doing or not doing? How can you be so arrogant? And it turns them away from God. And that, to my mind, condemns the whole thing. We mustn't try to second guess what God is doing, but rather take the line that Jesus did and say to people, look, this is happening and it's reminding us of eternity. Are you ready to go into eternity and meet God, as one day you surely will?
Okay, good. Here's a different question. How do we best prepare our youth to be able to meet the questions of today's world?
Well, these questions I find almost impossible, but thank you. I can understand the motivation. It's a generic question. Which youth? What age? What intellectual ability? What background? What country? And I would say to you, I'm glad you're interested in youth. And what you've got to do is a lot of hard work to get to know the youth in the Faroe Islands and to listen to them and find out what their questions are. And this brings me to a general point with all of us. We all, if we are Christians, then we have a responsibility to attempt to answer people's questions. But first of all, we must hear what their questions are. And that's hugely important. When I was young, I was told that I had 2 ears and 1 mouth, and I should use them in that proportion. In other words, I should listen much more than I talk. And it's very enriching, and I'm speaking to Christians now, but the principle is general. People love to explain to others what they think and what motivates them. And I try, when I meet new people, to keep asking them questions until they ask me one. And if it's young people, they love to have an audience of an older person. And that's the only way I believe you'll get to know what their questions are. And then if you are a Christian believer, you will have to consult with others, do some reading, and find answers for them. And they will appreciate your making that effort. But there's no shortcut here.
Yeah. Okay, here's one. The Bible speaks of a plague that will happen before Jesus comes back. Do you think the coronavirus is this plague?
Well, first of all, let's establish what Jesus said. And you're referring, of course, to the Olivet Discourse, where his disciples asked him what the sign of his coming would be. And he said there will be wars and rumors of wars, and there will be pestilences and earthquakes and all this kind of thing. But notice exactly what he then said. He said the end is not yet. Now, without knowing what function the coronavirus has, it certainly shows us what can happen. And Jesus said that such things would happen, and they are happening. So that, in that sense, confirms his word. But whether he was precisely speaking of this one, I don't know. But notice carefully, these things are signs that the end is not yet, not signs that the end is about to come. So if we're going to believe what Jesus said, we must take two sides of that and be careful with identifications. That whole speech has two sides to it. The disciples wanted to know, would there be any evidence of Jesus coming? And he said, yes, there is, but be very careful that you don't try to guess it, because many people will come in my name and say, I am the Messiah. Don't listen to them, because when it happens, it would be totally obvious. So my own reaction is, yes, this is the kind of thing he promised would happen. But whether this is a specific fulfillment of what he said, I just don't know. But in a sense, it doesn't matter, because history is building up to show that his words, as he said, heaven and earth will pass away, but my word will not.
So here's one question. Can you clarify your point on atheists being responsible for the spread of the coronavirus?
I didn't say
No.
atheists were responsible.
Yeah, I think so too.
No, that's confusion.
Yeah.
Look, what I said was this. Now listen carefully and don't misunderstand me. I've been reading a World Health Organization report given at the highest level by experts on animal welfare. You can Google it. It is a very authoritative report. And they say that if this thing started, as it may have done, by jumping, as other virus infections have done, from wild animals to humans, the reason for that is putting wild animals in cages out of their natural free environment and putting them under such emotional stress that they excrete all kinds of very dangerous viruses that they would not normally excrete. And then if humans are near, they jump. And therefore, what I said, I didn't mention atheism in that context. What I said was, this could be a result of human greed. Those animals are very expensive. They're regarded as a delicacy. And so if that is the case, then those animals were in those cages because they were for sale, because somebody wanted to make a lot of money. And in that sense, it's moral evil at the start. And we see that all the time. Greed, for example, for money, leads some big businesses to cut down a forest and turn it into a desert. And then that results in people starving. So you've got a moral evil, greed, leading to a natural evil, starvation because nothing will grow. And the world is very complex in that sense. So that is what I said, but don't misunderstand or misquote me, please.
Yeah, it was good to clarify that one. So there's a different one here. Do you think Jesus rising from the dead is the answer to death?
Well, in that strict sense, Jesus rising from the dead means there's a human who has conquered death. But it's more than that. You see, the resurrection happened 20 centuries ago. But it means that Jesus is still alive. Things didn't end with the resurrection. And I believe what the New Testament tells us, that Jesus went back into the world from which he had come, and he will eventually come again. Now, what the apostles tell us is this, that resurrection is to be regarded like a harvest, a great wheat harvest. And you will know from farming that when the time of the year comes round, the farmer will inspect the grain that's coming up and he'll say, oh, we're in for a wonderful harvest this year because look at the first fruits, the first stuff to come up out of the ground. And Paul says that the same is going to happen. Jesus Christ is the first fruits of a vast harvest of resurrection that will occur when he returns. And those who've trusted him, the dead in Christ, will rise. So it's not simply the fact historically that he rose, but the fact that he is alive means he can be encountered today, and we can get to know him. And the very life that raised him from the dead is something we can receive as a free gift. And it's that life that I, for example, already possess that will raise me from the dead in the end. So we mustn't look at resurrection as just saying, well, Jesus was one who rose from the dead. So what? Jesus claimed to be God incarnate. And the resurrection is evidence of that. That is what Paul said to the philosophers at Athens centuries ago, that Jesus rising from the dead shows he's the Son of God, and shows, incidentally, that he is going to be the judge at the end of the age, which is a huge claim. So there are a lot of things that flow out of the resurrection. It has major implications, and it's those implications that you need to consider when asking what its significance is.
So now there's a question about evil. What about the brutal riots in America, the police brutality? What kind of evil is that?
Well, I think you know the answer to that, all of you. It's racism, and it's human evil. And it breaks your heart to see this kind of thing in a civilized society. I'm not an American. I don't live there. But we have heard Christians and others commenting on it. And I would have thought the answer to your question is absolutely obvious. What kind of evil is it? It's human moral evil, and it's racial superiority. And the Bible says that God made of one, that is, of one man, every race of men, all men and women, no matter what their color, what their ethnic background, are all made in the image of God and therefore of infinite value. And that has lived with me all of my life, and that's what's missing. If you start to regard any one group in society as what Nietzsche, I think it was, called Untermenschen, lower than human, then you treat them like dirt. And I'm afraid that so far as one can see, that is what we are seeing. And unless they deal with it very carefully, very swiftly, and very clearly, America looks as if it could go up in flames. It's a very serious situation.
Yeah. You mentioned greed. Do you think that the eternal greed and expansion of capitalism is compatible with Christianity and Jesus?
Well, that's a generic question. You know, in capitalism is a word that can describe something that is actual biblical. If I'm a farmer and I have a lot of grain and I've harvested it, okay, if I retain none of it and give it all away, the farm will go bust the next year and I won't be able to pay my workers. And so that principle of having capital, investing it, and all this kind of thing is thoroughly biblical. But when greed starts to add to that, people wanting more than they should have. And Luke's gospel puts it this way. Jesus once said, a man's life does not consist in the excess of what he possesses. That is over and beyond what he needs. And therefore, we need to be careful before we judge. For example, I'm an academic. I've never really given a job to anybody. I have great respect for Christian business leaders that I know who've given jobs to thousands of people, and they take the risk of the investment. And when I see what some of them do with their money in terms of charity, I'm just staggered. So the danger is that we make a political statement. They say capitalism is evil. You can't say that. We are all stewards, and this is what I much prefer. The biblical attitude is we are stewards of what we possess. And in the end, we will answer to God for what we do with what we've got. And it'll be no use saying in that day, oh, well, so-and-so was a horrible, vicious capitalist. Well, maybe, and that is evil, but what about me? And that's a much more difficult question to answer, because we see others who have more than we have, but we have more than others have. And we need to be very careful with that.
So a question about, the growing number of seekers we're seeing today. Why do you think many people are seeking Jesus now when COVID-19 attacks?
Because it's an instinct that we saw in the last war. It's an instinct that was seen way back in a far worse pandemic that we're experiencing, the Black Death in the Middle Ages. And it's very interesting that Christianity spread very rapidly after one of the early plagues, because the emperor, the Roman emperor, noticed to his amazement that the Christians not only risked their lives for Christian people, they risked their lives for non-Christian people. And I would like to say this, it's very easy to forget that hospitals, hospices, nursing, and all of those things are a legacy of Christianity. And it is a remarkable fact that many, many doctors and nurses on the front line are believers. Now, many are not, of course, and I admire them equally. But it's important to realize that Christianity has been very active in spreading the message, not in a theoretical form, but in a very practical outworking of their care for people around.
Then there's a question about, laws in Leviticus. Do you think the hygiene, food, and social distancing laws in Leviticus show the heart of God for his people? And do you think these passages show us today the relevance of the Bible?
Well, that certainly is true. And it has been written about as well. I can't remember the reference, but there's some very interesting things that some of these laws are not arbitrary. Just for the sake of it. They are actually helping people, and they're helping them deal with infection by distancing. And so the person who asked the question is right. There's a lot of very practical medicine in the ancient world that we can learn from, the cleanliness of water and all this kind of thing. So yes, certainly, but you would need to read, there's an excellent book whose name I can't recall, that goes into all the different things that we have learned from that are already in Scripture.
Okay, we will go to a different question. What are your thoughts on discussion between atheists and Christians? I feel like it often does not lead to be uplifting for anyone involved. So, is it wise for us as Christians to jump on the Christian versus atheist boat, where it mostly only divides us even more from the people we are supposed to love and care for? I feel like we Christians get carried away in our own pride and will to be right, instead to humble ourselves to our oppressors.
Well, you can only speak for yourself. You know, again, you're asking a question to me. I don't know you. I don't know if that's a problem that you've got. I think that we are commanded by our Lord to take the message to all nations. And that includes to our atheist friends. And if it leads to a lot of strife, that simply shows that we are not befriending them before we try to give them a message. Now, I have written not long ago a little book talking about this hugely important topic, how to approach people and avoid the things you're saying. It's called Have No Fear, because the danger with the sort of thinking, if I understood you correctly, is that we shut ourselves in a ghetto and our lives just cease to be real. The New Testament does not contemplate a person that is not witnessing to their faith. Now, I didn't say preaching. I mean discussing, gossiping, talking to other people and showing that you've got something to say into the big issues of the day. Now, that's a very important topic that you've raised. But we befriend as many people as we can, not just Christians, and we seek to share the message with them as we get the opportunity without threatening them, pushing it down their throat or anything like that.
Yeah. A different one again. It seems to me that in order to believe in God, one must first have a certain minimum of faith in one's own thought or ability to think or discern. For if I were not able to trust my ability to tell, for example, word apart from word, how could I trust my ability to discern God correctly and believe in God correctly? Would you agree? If so, is it good or is it evil?
Well, you haven't a problem with that. You trusted your mind enough to ask me that question, and you assumed and believed that I would understand it, and you were quite correct. I think this kind of question is actually self-defeating. We all must start somewhere. And your question is actually very interesting because the pioneers of modern science, like Isaac Newton and Galileo and Kepler and so on, they use their minds to do science. Now, why would you trust your mind to do science? Well, the thing that drove them was that they were convinced that there was a mind, the mind of God behind the universe. And you've got to start somewhere. But I see you've already done that, so it's no longer a problem for you, clearly.
Yes. Another question. Do you think that we as Christians should accept COVID-19 isolation, since we are told to do different things in the Bible?
Like what?
Yeah, that's a good question.
No, that's the isolation is a sensible and a biblical thing, as we heard from another question, but it's also a requirement of our government. Now, obedience to our government is something that all Christians should demonstrate, unless the government is crossing the line of ordering us to do things that are contrary to the moral precepts of the Bible. But this is not a moral precept. It's a bit of medical advice based on statistical analysis. And therefore, it's highly sensible. And we do not help the situation, especially as Christians, if we get the reputation of breaking lockdown. That is a very serious reputation for anybody to get. And I'm almost amazed that the question gets asked.
Okay, now a question about EU and the world. Why do you think the EU and the world is more and more turning away from God?
That's a hugely complex question. It goes back a long way, and it has to do with many things, including the Enlightenment and the French Revolution and the corruption of a state church and the whole attitude of intellectuals to clergymen and to priests and so on. That's a vastly complex question, and we'd need to spend hours on it. The more important thing is, it is the fact, and we have to face that. And it's dealing with that that's far more important than what its roots are. But there are plenty of interesting books on that you can read, and you'll have to search them for yourselves.
Yeah. So, we're almost done, but I think we can do one or two more questions. What are some of the best and most important ways for the church to reach out to their communities in the post-COVID-19 times? Many have stopped and begin to think about the deep questions of in life, and therefore look at online services. What are some of the deep questions Christians should think and implement into church practice post-COVID-19?
Well, of course, we've discussed most of them already. I think that we need to be present in our society to deal with a whole range of questions, intellectual questions, but then there's been a lot of mental and emotional fallout from COVID-19. And people need a space where they can talk about their feelings, the difficulties they've had with their children and their relatives, perhaps the process of grieving and all of that. And I think that churches, and I can imagine you doing that in the Faroes Islands, organizing coffee mornings and getting people in to discuss the best way forward and listening to them and listening to their suggestions and asking them, how can we best serve you and help you? And each church has to work that out for themselves. I'm not a church leader, and therefore I wouldn't dare to presume what you should do, but mature people who are church leaders and elders and pastors and so on, I think it's an important time to get together, even on Skype or Zoom if you can't physically get together, and discuss the opportunities that are being given.
Okay, what are your opinions on secularism? I, as an atheist, find it very upsetting to be living in a country often referred to as a Christian nation, and having to deal with religious indoctrination throughout all my child years in school. It seems I am haunted by Christianity wherever I go, and I don't really feel like I belong in my own country due to being an atheist.
Well, I don't know you, I'm afraid. I resonate with you because I was brought up in a country where it was professedly Christian, but the Christianity in most parts didn't appeal to me at all. And there was a lot of indoctrination. And if I knew you, I would want to sit down and find out why you find it threatening. After all, if you don't believe in God and are comfortable in that belief, why does it bother you, these people that do believe in God? And I don't know whether you're a young person or an older person. If you're an older person, why are you feeling threatened? I'm amazed at that, because a large proportion of Europe, atheism is growing very rapidly indeed. So what I'm saying to you, I cannot answer your question, and you should understand that. I've said many times, I've done nearly 50 of these interviews, and personal questions like that come up, and I'm not in a position to answer them simply because I don't know exactly where you're coming from and what your fears are and your hopes are. I certainly sympathize with you, and I would be very sad to think that anybody is feeling under threat from Christianity. But I find it difficult to imagine in a modern, well-educated nation like the Faroes how that could possibly happen. But I think you'll have to come and have a chat with somebody like Ranyard and his colleagues and talk about what makes you feel as you do.
Okay, we will take one more, maybe two more questions, and then that's it. So this one, do you have any opinion on the fact that poverty and religiosity go hand in hand in most countries in the world? Why would the places with the most religious people be the worst places in the world to live in economically?
I just don't know. Here's a generic question. I'm sitting here locked down. I'm in my mid-70s. I've had a limited experience of the world, but I have seen what you mean. I saw it in South Africa. Some of the poorest people I met were the people that were closest to God. And it doesn't take much imagination to see why. That if people don't have a lot of this world's material cluttering up their lives, something that's deeper and bigger will appeal to them and get through to them. We fill our lives with noise. We fill our lives with things. And people who don't have all those things, it seems to me, are often living under a clearer sky to see God through than the rest of us are. And therefore we can learn a great deal from them. I think it's the Lord went to people that were of very lowly stature. I mean, he was as well. His disciples were not high-powered politicians or businessmen. And for the large part, Christianity was a movement among relatively poor people. So I think you're making a perceptive comment.
So Perhaps you agree with this one. In all this coronavirus confusion, it's amazing how comforting it is to trust in our Lord, in his total control in all what's happening. That's giving a comfortable sleep at night.
Well, that's easy to say if I can be very straight with you. I'm not sure that I would say that if I was a COVID virus doctor with 4 children and I was in my 30s and had to get up tomorrow morning and go into a ward where I could catch this. We need to be very careful that not everybody is coming from the same place as we are. And there are many people tonight who are not going to get a comfortable night's sleep because they're scared. And some of them are Christians. And we need to give them all respect. Well, I am at the end of my energy, I'm afraid. And I'd like to thank you very much for having me on. And thank Ragnar for his excellent questioning. And I trust this will encourage you to have a look at my little book and look at my website, johnlennox.org. I can't answer all your questions, of course not. But if I've been able to point you just a little in the direction of the one who claimed to be the truth, Christ himself, I shall feel it has been a very well worthwhile evening with you in the Faroe Islands.
I have one more very short question. It should be very easy to answer. But is it true that you're publishing another book today?
Yes. Today is the book launch of a book called 2084, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Humanity. But that is a discussion for another time.
Well, John, it's been great to having you on tonight, and thank you very much for giving time for this.
My pleasure.
And all the
Good
best
night.
to you and your wife, Sally. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ragnar. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Ja, så er vi kommet til endan av Heson, for min part rettelig avhverda kveld nå, i John Lennox, og vi har at alt ting kan henge på seg ord. Kanskje man får hotel Moira. Man kan kjøpe seg bøtjene. Til suttja prisen her at vanlige priser 55 kroner, og så kan man kjøpe 4 eller flere for 45 kroner stykket, og så er det også et annet tilbud her vid her man kan kjøpe hese bøtjene og god for skåten for seriepris for 225 kroner. Og dette kan kjøpes av två nethandlene til Lord Cherry FO og manna.fo. Og bilegg man i det, så er det gode mulighet for å få bøtjene eller bøkene her høstdagen. Og vi kunne få mer enn hese bøtjene. Vi talar fram kommande mannakvöld. Vi har någon öron tilltäcke. Det är att en samråd och Q&A vi Peter J. Williams. Han är engländinger. Han är inte via Oxford, men han har läst i Cambridge. Han undervisste han läser PhD i Cambridge och han är undervisst här. Han är undervisst i Aberdeen, University of Aberdeen. Og her han med landet undervisst i Føringon, noen Føringon. Så i 2006 har han vært rektor i Tyndale House i Cambridge, og så har han også aktivt lektor i universiteten i Cambridge. Han er formar i International Greek New Testament Project. Han er gransket nekvo i Nytestamentet, og i spurningen om evangelien i alle landet. John Lennox, han har vært hos sin kveld om nekker evangelietekster, men spurningen om det er alle landet. Det er altså kritikere som halter at hans evangelien her, de kunne ikke ha alda. Det här vi läsa om chattande kristen trunne, det här vi läsa om Jesu deia, Jesu upprøst, men kritikeren sier at, varst kvart, hæsa skriften er å skriva av ørene egna vittnen, kanskje folk som slett levde i Israel, kanskje folk som levde lengt vekk i Israel, og nekk var skjøttene, kanskje 4 eller 3 år at det hendte. Så Peter Williams, han har arbeidet nekk i som spårningen, og i 2018 skrev en bok som heter Can We Trust the Gospels? Og det var så evne kommende mannakveld. Etter det bare sier takk for kveld, og velnande så gjøres vi kommende mannakveld.